For more than 3 years, the world's attention has been fixed on the front lines in Ukraine. But if you want to understand where this war is actually heading, the front line is no longer the most useful place to look. The more revealing battlefield right now is a balance sheet, the Russian federal budget, the central bank's rate decisions, and a sovereign wealth fund that is quietly running out of money. Let me walk you through why, because the picture that emerges when you put the numbers side by side is considerably more precise than sanctions are working, or Russia's economy is resilient. Both of those statements are true in fragments. Neither is the full story. Let's start with the financing problem, because everything else flows from it. Russia entered 2026 with a state budget signed into law by Vladimir Putin in late November, and even by the government's own optimistic assumptions on oil prices, on growth, on tax collection, that budget carries a deficit equivalent to roughly 9% of planned spending. To put that in perspective, for the first time since the full-scale invasion began, the Kremlin has actually announced a reduction in defense funding, not because priorities have shifted, but because the money genuinely is not there in the same quantities it used to be. Public debt itself is not the alarming figure. At around 18 to 20% of GDP, Russia's debt load looks almost conservative by the standards of, say, the United States or Japan. The alarming figure is the cost of servicing that debt. In 2021, interest payments consumed less than 1% of GDP. By 2026, that figure has roughly doubled, approaching 2% of GDP, nearly 9% of total federal spending, because the Bank of Russia has had to hold its key interest rate at levels between 14.5 and 16% for an extended period simply to keep inflation from spiraling. That's down from a peak of 21% in 2024, but down from 21 is not the same as affordable. At that rate, every ruble the government borrows to cover today's deficit generates a meaningfully larger interest obligation next year. And next year's deficit has to cover both the new spending and the old debt's interest. That is the arithmetic of a debt spiral, even when the headline debt-to-GDP ratio still looks manageable on paper. Now, why is inflation still so stubborn that rates have to stay this high? Wartime spending is inherently inflationary because it pulls resources, labor, materials, industrial capacity, into producing things that never reach a consumer shelf. A shell casing does not compete for grocery money the way a washing machine does, but the wages paid to the worker who makes it absolutely do. Annual inflation has come down from painful double digits toward the high single digits. Reports through the first half of 2026 put it somewhere in the 5.5 to 8% range, depending on the month and the methodology. But the central bank's own target is 4%, and it has not been hit. Household inflation expectations, which matter enormously for how people actually spend and save, climbed back above 13% in recent readings. That gap between official inflation and what ordinary Russians expect prices to do next year tells you something important. Confidence in the disinflation story is thin, even inside the country. This is where the private sector enters the story, and where the damage becomes structural rather than cyclical. A double-digit interest rate does not touch every sector of the Russian economy equally. The defense industrial sector is largely insulated. It receives state orders, advances, and subsidized financing that operate outside normal market discipline. Everyone else is not so lucky. Small and medium enterprises, construction firms, and consumer goods producers are borrowing less, expanding less, and in a growing number of cases, simply trying to survive until conditions ease. Overdue corporate debt has climbed past 8 trillion rubles, close to 4% of GDP, roughly 60% higher than it stood at the start of the war. When that many firms are straining to service existing loans, banks respond by tightening credit further, which chokes off exactly the investment that a stagnating civilian economy needs to recover. That is the feedback loop economists worry about. High rates fight inflation, but they simultaneously starve the non-military economy of the capital it would need to grow its way out of the hole. Layer onto that a labor market that looks healthy on the surface and is anything but underneath. Unemployment sits near historic lows, around 2 to 3%. Normally, that would be a sign of strength. Here, it is a symptom of distortion. The military and the defense industrial complex have absorbed workers that the civilian economy shed or never generated, offering signing bonuses reportedly around 2 million rubles, more than $20,000, that no ordinary manufacturer can compete with. Russia's own Ministry of Labor projects a shortfall approaching 3 million workers by decade's end. Civilian firms are being forced to raise wages to compete for a shrinking labor pool. Those higher wages feed straight back into inflation, and the central bank is forced to keep rates elevated in response. Low unemployment in this specific configuration is not evidence of a healthy economy. It is evidence of an economy being systematically reallocated toward war production at the expense of everything else. Now, to the reserves, because this is the mechanism that actually puts a clock on the situation. Russia's National Wealth Fund was built during the years of high oil revenue precisely to be a shock absorber. Under the country's own fiscal rule, when oil and gas revenue falls short of budget assumptions, the shortfall is covered by drawing down that fund. It has been doing exactly that at pace. The liquid portion of the NWF stood at roughly 9.7 trillion rubles in March 2022. By the spring of 2026, it had fallen to somewhere between 3.9 and 4.2 trillion rubles, a decline of more than half in a little over 4 years, with a portion of what remains held in gold rather than freely spendable currency. Russia's own Presidential Economic Academy has publicly warned that the fund's liquid reserves could be effectively exhausted if current trends continue. When your rainy day fund is running out at a rate close to 13 billion rubles a day during periods of oil price weakness, the rainy day fund stops functioning as a long-term cushion and starts functioning as a countdown. And the revenue side of that equation has its own problem: oil. The 2026 budget was built on an assumed Urals crude price in the high $50 range. For stretches of the year, actual prices have run well below that assumption, at one point more than 40% below the budgeted level, creating shortfalls measured in the hundreds of billions of rubles per month. Global forecasters, including the World Bank, have projected Brent crude averaging closer to $60 a barrel in 2026, the lowest in 5 years, driven by an oversupplied global market. A strengthening ruble compounds the problem from a different angle. It makes Russian oil exports worth fewer rubles, even when the dollar price holds steady, which is precisely backwards from what the finance ministry needs. This is why you've seen Moscow raise the value-added tax from 20 to 22%, lower the revenue threshold that triggers mandatory VAT registration for small businesses, and introduce new levies on electronics. Not because the government wants to tax its population more, but because oil revenue, the traditional foundation of Russian public finance, is simply not generating what the budget requires. None of this, to be precise, is collapse. Let's not overstate the case. Grocery stores remain stocked. There have been no bank runs. The ruble has not disintegrated. Large, resource-rich economies with a command and control fiscal apparatus have enormous capacity to absorb pain, redirect resources, and simply choose not to publish the statistics that would make the picture clearer to outside observers, which, notably, Russia has started doing, having quietly stopped releasing certain data series on government headcount and related fiscal detail. Richard Connolly and other Russia economy specialists have made a point worth taking seriously. High inflation does not translate into Western-style political backlash in Russia the way it might elsewhere, in part because of a cultural memory of the far more severe economic shocks of the 1990s, and in part because state media has been effective at framing every privation as a necessary wartime sacrifice. But resilience is not the same thing as strength, and endurance is not the same thing as sustainability. What the data actually shows is an economy where the war-adjacent sector continues to grow while the civilian economy stagnates or contracts, where interest rates remain painfully high because the alternative is inflation. The government cannot politically survive, where the fiscal cushion that once allowed Moscow to absorb shocks is being drawn down at a rate that puts a visible expiration date on the strategy, and where the burden of financing all of this is increasingly falling on regional governments, many of which are now implementing austerity measures in education and healthcare, and on ordinary households through higher consumption taxes and interest rates that discourage exactly the borrowing and investment a stagnant economy needs. So here is the actual analytical question, and it's not the one most coverage is asking. It is not, can Russia keep fighting this year? Large states with command economies can generally find the money to keep fighting for a considerable time, by cutting elsewhere, by taxing more, by drawing down what remains of their reserves. That's the frame I'd encourage you to carry forward. Not is Russia winning or losing, but what is this war spending down that won't come back? If you want to track it yourself, 3 numbers do most of the work. The National Wealth Fund's liquid balance, the spread between Russia's key rate and its inflation rate, and the civilian investment figures the central bank publishes each quarter. Those 3, read together, will tell you more about where this ends than any frontline map. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribe. I'll be tracking these same indicators as new data comes in through the rest of the year. And if you think I've gotten the read wrong on any of this, say so in the comments. This is an argument built on numbers, and numbers are worth arguing about with evidence, not certainty. I'll see you in the next one.